introducing our speaker tonight, Dr. Marie Rose Wong. She is a retired professor from Seattle University who has won numerous awards for her teaching, research, and publications in the field of urban housing, land use, and planning and policy with the focus of Asian American settlement. She has written books on the history of Portland and Seattle's Chinese, Japanese, and Filipino communities, and is currently working on 2 more books. She also serves on the board of Interim Community Development Association, which aims to promote the sustainability and restoration of single-room occupancy residential hotels and construction of affordable housing in Seattle's Chinatown International District. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much, and good evening to everybody. I think before I get started, I'd like to make mention that my mentor, Wong, that you're going to be listening to tomorrow, is here tonight. And you know, whenever your major mentor is in the room, all of a sudden you start to clutch, and I think you know what I'm talking about. When I was a student, and I was having some issues trying to figure out how do I introduce research that I am doing about Portland's Chinatown. And so I went to Sean's office and I asked him, you know, what is the best recommendation that you can give to me so that I can write a good, solid introduction to get people interested in this topic and so that they're interested in exploring this. And the advice that he gave me was to get personal. That if I was going to write an introduction, that I should feel like I can put myself into the writing, and so that people would understand where I was coming from, where the ideas were coming from, and that this really meant something to me beyond a research project. I mean, research is always a little bit personal, but he suggested that I really go inside of why was this interesting to me in the first place? Okay, so that was the first piece of advice he gave me. And the second piece was, he said, I was looking at Chinese American history and he said, why don't you go to the National Archives, the regional office that's in Seattle, and why don't you take a look at the Chinese exclusion case file records? He said, just look at a few of them. But after, about a year and a half later, and I went back to his office and he said, I knew that you would get hooked. You were the student that was going to keep working on this, and that's exactly what happened. But the recommendation to get personal with the writing really meant a lot to me because it's kind of led me into the introductions that I've written for both of the books and all of the articles, and I'm going to say all of the work that I do becomes very, very personal. So tonight I want to talk with you about the residential hotels, and I'm going to try to focus specifically on Chinatown, or the Chinese American part of the Chinatown International District in Seattle. But there's always going to be just a little bit of an overlap because that's the way the district has always been. So this is getting personal. This is my dad, who was a Chinese immigrant, and he was one of or not one of the 95% of Chinese Americans who settled on the West Coast. My dad had wanderlust and he went up and down the West Coast and he eventually went into Iowa where he met my mother. My dad was not working in a restaurant. My mother was a waitress in the restaurant, and they got married and he stayed in Iowa. So he was not your typical Chinese immigrant. Every summer, my dad would take vegetables. He was a great gardener, and he would take vegetables and buckets of all kinds of vegetables and fruits. And he would go to those communities that were close to where we lived. I lived in north central Iowa. And he would take all of this to the restaurants in Rochester and Albert Lee, and sometimes he would go to Chicago. And the exchange was he would give the restaurant people these vegetables, and in exchange, he would get conversation and seafood. So it was a really nice interaction that would take place every summer. The only downside of it was, and I didn't realize this until I became an adult, was that when I started studying the SROs, the single room occupancy residential hotels, it was then that I realized that that's exactly the kind of lodging house that we were staying in when we went to these various places in Minnesota. So that's how I got interested or made the connection with the places that were important to my father. He could have stayed any place, but he chose to stay in a residential hotel. So the study of SROs began when I started assisting a tour that was taking place in Seattle, and it was actually an urban history tour. And I was kind of bringing up the rear of the tour, and there were all of these people that were going past, and they all expressed how disappointed they were in looking at Seattle's Chinatown International District. They were completely dissatisfied at what they were seeing because it didn't look like the image that was going to satisfy them with the identity of what Chinese America was. So there was a lot of dissatisfaction. The image that you see on the right is the Panama Hotel, and that's actually where I heard this conversation taking place. And the left image, building in San Francisco. And that's what they expected to see. So as we were going through the district and they're seeing these rather spare looking brick masonry buildings, they were upset at the identity. So the big question then was why? Why did Seattle look so different? What happened that made this community deviate so strongly in that feeling of identity and the thing that satisfies the image that you have of what Chinese America is? Now, this building, the Panama Hotel, even though people were dissatisfied with it, in 2015, the Panama Hotel was designated as the national treasure by the National Register of Historic Places. It's one of 91 such buildings throughout the United States. It's the only building in Seattle that has that designation. Even though the Space Needle is something that everybody recognizes, it still didn't make the cut for what they consider to be a national treasure. So, yeah. So why? Part of this, I think, was an identity issue. That if you look at the labeling that has taken place in the Chinatown International District, over 100 years, there has been so much change about what this neighborhood should really be called. So starting in 1860, it was actually the Immigration and Naturalization Service that identified the district, not the current district, but the first district of Chinese Americans. That's the one that they called just Chinatown. It wasn't until the 1950s when they started calling it the International Center. That was the mayor's idea, or the then mayor, that he had this idea that we're going to advertise this neighborhood and try to sell it economically as a good tourist center. And we don't want to just call it Chinatown, because at the time he was thinking that Chinatown had too negative of a connotation. So let's call it the International Center. That sounds a little more, cosmopolitan. And so they changed the name. Now, the one thing that's interesting is that even though the name has changed and just keeps changing, now this banner I put 1998, Chinatown International District, they buy all of these banners, they hang them in the CID, and are people satisfied? Some of them are, and some of them aren't. The one thing that I've learned about being part of that community is that everything is potentially contentious. Everything is, including a banner that celebrates the community. And if you go there now, the banners are gone, except for the one that's in my garage. I do have one that I rescued. But the name has continued to change. Now the city, even though it has all of these names and they called it the International Center, the city of Seattle has never made a formal declaration of what the neighborhood is called. They don't want to touch it. Politically, they're too smart to make any kind of a name change or to make an official name. The only thing they've come close to is they recognize the neighborhood plan as being called the Chinatown International District Neighborhood Plan. They agreed to that, but that's because the neighborhood called it that. There's no official documentation, there's no ordinance, regardless of what some of the factions in the district say. Yes, it's officially the CID, it's not. Okay. As far as the identity goes, I think some of the struggle is also with the idea of this is really a Pan-Asian community. And this is not something that just happened since the 1950s or the 1970s. It's always been a Pan-Asian community. And to give you just a little bit of information about the profile of the community, geographically, it's about a third of a square mile. The people who live there, there are about 4,200 residents. It has a very high population or percentage of individuals who are elderly. About a third of the neighborhood are people who are, I hate to say this, folks, but older than 62. 45% of the community have an income of $25,000 a year or less. It's also an area that has 29 extant residential hotels. So you can kind of see that actually this is a really nice core shot of the residential hotels that are still part of the district. And frankly, we're lucky to have them. The demography of the history of Chinese America, Seattle really is like many of the other Chinese neighborhoods and Chinatowns in the United States and also in Canada, that there was this preponderance of males that made up the community. And some of this is related to immigration patterns, most definitely the idea of women immigrating. And there are reasons that women didn't immigrate. You know, there were cultural responsibilities and expectations of women in China. And there was also the length of the journey, the cost of the journey. If you have Chinese that are coming over for laboring positions, and they are coming over on a credit ticket system where they're borrowing money, it's highly unlikely that they're going to want to borrow money to bring their wives over also. So it starts this pattern of a primarily male community. And as I mentioned when I first started talking, about 95% of the Chinese that immigrated into the United States came in and settled on the West Coast. And you can kind of see that the ratios, the male to female ratios were incredibly stark. The reason this demography becomes important is because of their living accommodations. If you've got a population that's going to be primarily male, the needs of that male community are not going to be the same as you're going to expect like a single family detached residential unit. As far as their work goes, this was a male population of Chinese that were considered to be, well, they were unskilled workers, I'll put that in scare quotes. They were cheap, they were willing labor, they filled the gap for a lot of development projects that were taking place as cities were really starting to build their own strength. And I'm going to say also build their desire for attention as being a great city. There was a huge rivalry that has always taken place between Seattle and Tacoma. I think it still probably is real now as it was when both of the cities really started to be recognized. But as far as the labor that they were filling, railroad workers, and in fact, this upper left image shows them not building railroads, but actually in charge of railroad maintenance. These were called Gandhi dancers. Gandhi was actually a company out of Chicago that made railroad ties, and that swaying of those carts, they got the label of the Gandhi dancer. But other jobs that they were involved with, farming, and this won't be foreign to you at all about Walla Walla. I've been doing a little bit of reading about the town and what the Chinese were actually doing, where they were living. But farming, wood chopping was a huge, huge industry. And I'm gonna say specifically in Oregon, also in Washington, because cutting trees for development was a really big operation. Mining, public works projects, brick making was big, digging culverts, roads. All of this all of these were examples of economic opportunities that the Chinese got involved with. When the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, there were about 12,000 Chinese that were out of work. And they were out of work along with other labor. You know, the United States is constantly going through these periods of cyclical economic decline. And it was no different when labor unions started looking at who are we gonna blame for this? I mean, we're not working, the national economy is bad. So they start looking for the scapegoat, and they targeted the Chinese. Well, it's their fault that they're taking the jobs away from white labor. And you can see that of these two journals, both of them from 1877, the Illustrated Wasp and Puck magazine. Okay, Puck was being published out of New York. The Illustrated Wasp was being published out of California. And at the time, the Wasp was the most widely read journal on the West Coast. And both of these were kind of playing on political satire. That, in fact, the Wasp, I don't think there was one issue of the Wasp that ever came out that didn't have some kind of a cartoon or some kind of commentary that they were making about the Chinese being to blame. They're the individuals who are secretly undermining American industry by creating their own monopolies. And so these kinds of images were very, very common for the magazine. And then images like this, suggestions that, well, one way we can keep them out, let's build walls. Let's build walls around our borders because that's the way that we're gonna make sure that the Chinese don't come into the United States. Does any of this sound familiar to you? Okay. And they're coming in from Canada and they're coming in through Mexico. The National Archives had various documents and photographs that they would suspect that one of these wagons coming across the border, well, I don't know if these wagons are really just having commodities, or maybe there are people that are inside the wagons, and they did find that from the bottom of the wagon to the surface on the inside, there would be people that would be smuggling themselves across the border. So let's build the wall. That's the way we're gonna solve this. In response to that, organized labor starts putting pressure on the federal government. It's your responsibility to do something about this problem, to get the Chinese under control so that they'll stop taking jobs away from good white American workers. And so all of this pressure ends up getting Congress and the president to sign the Chinese Exclusion Law in 1882. Now, it was the first of a series of such laws, each one of them being more and more refined to address what they considered to be the Chinese problem. Now, kind of moving on, now that you've got kind of an idea of what was happening with the immigration of Chinese and how they were being viewed, the idea of being a naturalized citizen, if you were a Chinese immigrant, that opportunity to be a naturalized citizen had already been decided even before the significant numbers of Chinese were coming into the United States. So starting with the Naturalization Act, followed by, well, let me back up a little bit. In 1790, Congress had decided that naturalization was, quote, restricted to any alien being a free white person, end quote. So naturalization for the Chinese is now off the table, starting in 1790. It's reinforced, or the idea that you cannot become a naturalized citizen is reinforced again in 1870. Now, the importance of being a citizen was connected with the idea of whether you could own property. So if you can't be a citizen, you cannot own property. Washington Territory had already made that decision that you had to be a citizen or you had to be able to declare an intention to be a citizen. And if you already know that you can't become one, then legally you are not able to own property. Now, all of this idea was revived again under the Alien Land Law that started in California and ends up in Washington, along with 13 other states. So the idea, no citizenship, no property ownership. And yet, we know that they own property. So then the big question is, how did they manage to do it? And if you can just kind of hold on to that thought for just a little bit, and I'll get to it. Now, at the same time that the Chinese are establishing Chinatowns, and Chinatowns are being built in earnest, they're expanding. You know, if there's a lot of violence that is taking place outside of a formal urbanized setting, your opportunity for safety is going to be in the city. And it really you start to see this migration of individuals out of rural communities and into the safety of urban environments. So at the same time that Chinatown is building, you're also seeing the development of a unique American building type. These are not buildings that have been haphazardly just constructed to make a dollar. These were very well thought out, very carefully executed buildings. And the building was the single room occupancy residential hotel. So primarily, these are buildings that were constructed between 1880 and 1930. By about 1930, you start to see this as a building type kind of falling by the wayside. And part of that is because of technology and the ability to build higher. Why waste your land on a residential hotel that's only going to be between 2 and 6 stories when you can build something much higher? So by 1930, you start to see that fade. Now, this isn't to say that some of the residential hotels weren't constructed before 1880, because they were, and a lot of them were frame buildings. You start to see the shift from frame to masonry construction. You know, all cities have had some kind of major fire that's taken out the downtown. And in reading about Walla Walla, I learned that Walla Walla did too. But it changes the way that the way urban development takes place. So with housing codes, building codes, fire codes, they're all separate, but they're all intertwined. And those codes came together to say, okay, no more frame buildings. We're going masonry only. And you start to see this shift from 2-story frame buildings to something that is, you know, a 6-story, anywhere from 2 to 6 stories of masonry construction. So the SRO starts to make that kind of shift. The buildings themselves, they're typically built around transportation centers. So waterways and train stations. Train stations were big magnets for the construction of residential hotels. The building itself catered to laborers, single individuals, people that were of low income, which at the time included teachers, not that happens now, right? Okay. But the SRO was the perfect place for individuals of, we'll say, modest means, transient laborers. They were also buildings that were constructed and retained their presence and their identity even as central cities continued to develop. So the financial center of cities, commercial centers of cities, those were all starting to change, but on the downtown fringe, you would still see the development and the retention of these SROs. So this shot is taken from the top of the Milwaukee Hotel, and just in this one image, you know, there's the Bush, the NP, the Havana, the Panama, so all of these buildings are kind of surrounding this more intense development that takes place in Seattle's downtown. And Seattle's the prototype, okay? Because if you look at what was happening in Portland, Sacramento, San Francisco, it's the same kind of typology. It's the same kind of development that's taking place. The typology of these buildings, these were architect, contractor, builder designed buildings. They were not accidental. They were not buildings that were just renovated to meet the needs of transient laborers or people who wanted to stay in these structures. These were intentionally designed buildings. And what you're taking a look at with these images, all of these buildings, even if you look at the facade of them and you don't see it, every single one of these buildings has a light well. And they're very, very interesting to see how these architects managed to come up with ideas to provide air and light for all of those rooms that would be on the interior of a courtyard. So all of them have light wells. All of them have at-grade commercial. So the first floor on the sidewalk is going to have various bays of commercial. And then everything that is on the second floor up, so anywhere from the second to the sixth floor that's going to be the residential rooms. Now, these were market designs, and by market designs, I mean that somebody may design one of these buildings, but then maybe the person across the street says, well, I'm gonna build a residential hotel also, but I'm going to put sinks in every room. Believe it or not, having a sink in a room was an amenity. So if you had a sink with cold water, that's a great amenity. If you've got a sink with hot and cold water, that's a better amenity. So by market rate or market design, it was up to the individual where you wanted to stay. And these were buildings that had no leases. So you would stay for a night, a week, a month, but that was it. And at any time you could say, well, I really want to leave here. I'd like to go across the street because they've got a brand new building and it's got a sink in the room. And that's how there was all of this movement that was taking place in neighborhoods and the CID with the residential hotels. The rooms are very spare, they're very, very small. So I think that the smallest one that I saw was 8 by 10. That was the Publix hotel. They had a bed, you may have something like a desk. A desk was also an amenity, hooks on the wall, but maybe you had a wardrobe. Actually, it was interesting because the wardrobes were not constructed or not built as wardrobes. They were crates that other things would come in, and then the owner of the hotel would go to maybe the furniture store or one of these other businesses, and they would rescue the crates, and the crates would somehow become wardrobes. But that's an amenity. So these are really spare rooms. And they also have this double-loaded corridor, so as you're walking down the corridor, there's gonna be rooms on either side. And that's why that light well becomes really important, because if you have an interior room, you also wanna have that air and light coming in. Okay, so if you've got at-grade commercial, how do you get up to the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth floor? Well, all of these buildings had one entryway that would take you up, you ascend one flight of stairs, and there may be a manager there may be a manager space. I've only seen 3 hotels that ever had manager spaces. For the most part, you just walk into the door, go up the stairs, there's gonna be a little sign or a poster that says manager, you knock on the door. Even if the person that was operating the hotel did not speak English, and a lot of the people that had SROs didn't speak English. And in the course of doing the interviews of the people who either lived, worked, or owned the residential hotels, and I asked them, well, how did you manage to do that if you didn't speak English? Well, and the answer was so simple, I was embarrassed. They said, well, if they're coming into a residential hotel, what else do they want? That's right, you want a room. So basically, this is the topology of what the residential hotels are. What it did for America is that it started to redefine the concept of home. Because all of this is happening kind of on the tail end of Victorian propriety. The Victorians hated multifamily living. It was, it was potentially corrupt. Because you're living in close proximity with another human being that's not related to your family. They were completely against this idea. And yet these buildings kept being constructed and obviously were in demand, or people who were able to buy the land, build the structures, wouldn't have bothered doing it. They also had a continuous facade. So if you're going to look at one of these buildings, the only way that you can really tell where one building starts and ends is if you're across the street. And then it becomes clear to you because of the pattern of the brick, the materials that you're looking at, the height, the roof line. But these are all 0 lot line construction. So by 0 lot line, I mean they are built literally right up to the end of the lot. And if you have a building, an SRO that's already been constructed, there's a vacant lot next to you, but then they build a residential hotel, well, what do you do with your windows? Because you've already got windows in your hotel, and they're no longer necessary. This is actually the Panama Hotel. The NP was built 2 years after the Panama, and so they just took the glass out. This is actually the wall of the other hotel, and they turned it into a really nice air alcove to put potted flowers. Other cities, we're also following that same kind of idea of residential hotels. So even if the people on the tour were not happy with the way that Seattle's buildings looked, if you look at the history of other communities that have since rebuilt or relocated, they also had their share of residential hotels. So this is what San Francisco looked like in 1890, this is what Portland looked like in 1890, and you're looking at residential hotels. And I think when I was walking on Main Street and I was looking at some of the buildings, and I thought, wow, look at that. It's a 2-story building, it's a 3-story building, it's Italianate in architectural style, and it looks just like the buildings of the 1890s. And then I would look at the top and I saw, wow, 1897, 1895, yeah, residential hotels. They're everywhere. The core of Seattle's first Chinatown were these 2 residential hotels. They were built after Seattle's Great Fire in 1889. And they were commissioned by Chun Ching Hock. He's somebody that you don't hear a lot about. But they were commissioned by Chun Ching Hock, and this will answer the question on how did they do it. He's an immigrant Chinese. He's not a citizen, but he owned the land and he owned both of these buildings. And he did it legally by incorporating. That's the answer to the big question. A licensed corporation with the state of Washington could accomplish something that a Chinese immigrant as an individual could not do. So his company was the Wah-Chong. The Wah-Chong became so well known in Seattle's Chinatown that sometimes people would use the Wah-Chong interchangeably with his name. He became Mr. Wah-Chong. But that was the answer to the question, as long as you could incorporate. These 2 buildings, both constructed the year after the Great Fire, were noticed and recognized by the Seattle Times and the Post-Intelligencer as 2 of the finest masonry buildings that were constructed post-fire, owned by a Chinese immigrant. I should mention the Phoenix on the right and the Lexington Hotel on the left. And when you think about it, the Phoenix rising from the ashes after the fire, it's poetic. So the first Chinatown in Seattle is really kind of focused around the intersection of 2nd and Washington. And you can kind of see that this map shows the Chinese and the Japanese businesses. This is one of the problems, I think, with the identity of the CID in Seattle, is that as long as it's been a Pan-Asian community, and this is just in the early years before Filipino Americans started coming into Seattle, but it's always been a Pan-Asian community, and you can kind of see that this is a really big intermixing. So we've got this really mature Chinatown that is starting to develop around 2nd and Washington. The catalyst for opportunities, I'm gonna say they were great opportunities for the city and development. They were terrible for the first Chinatown. This is the Jackson Street regrade. City engineers love flattening land. I'm not exactly sure why, but they absolutely love it. This was done under Thompson, who was an engineer with the city, and he had this vision that he was going to flatten the hillsides south of Yesler Way, actually south of Jackson Street, and he had this plan that was going to affect 57 blocks of soil. And in fact, what is the figure I have here? Oh, moving 3.4 million cubic feet of earth in 3 years. That was the plan, because he wanted to see a better, easier connection between the central downtown and the financial district that was developing and the residential areas that were located just south and east, actually in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. He wanted to see a better, smoother connection. And, in those days, environmental concerns, forget that. We're not gonna care about the environment. We're not gonna worry about relocating the people. We just have to pay attention to how we wanna regrade this property. The hillsides, some of the hillsides that Thompson took down, were in excess of 85 feet high. So if you're ever in Seattle and you're driving along I-5, imagine a 6-story building put on top of I-5, and that's what they were sluicing. So where are you gonna put all this dirt? Well, you know, we don't like what's happening with Elliott Bay, and you know, the tide comes in, and half of every 24 hours we've got to worry about the tide. So wouldn't it be great? Let's take that soil and just shove it into Elliott Bay. Okay, so that was part of the plan. Anyway, this kind of shows you what the cut area was and what the fill area was. So this is the flooded area that, you know, Elliott Bay coming in. If you had a piece of property, you had 2 choices. You could sell your property out, or you would sign a waiver so that the city was held harmless if you want to elevate your property and allow them to take the land out from around you, as long as you don't get in their way. But you sign a waiver that you're gonna hold the city blameless if something happens to your property. So these companies would come and they would take your building and actually elevate it. This was the Japanese church. They sold their building out, somebody bought it, they didn't want to have this building torn down. So they take all these pallets and elevate the building, and then they did all of the work around it. The building's still there today. Very interesting. Became the Havana Hotel. The second project, so the regrade was one of the projects. This is all happening right around the turn of the 20th century. What a mess. I can't even imagine this. But these were the residential hotels. This is the Elliott Bay, the tide flat area, and I've got Fifth Avenue South. This was the future alignment of where that was gonna be, South Weller Street. But you can notice the residential hotels that were constructed, all built on piers. Well, the city was allowing some of these buildings, you could take out a permit, and you could say, well, I wanna put a basement in my building. Well, how are you gonna put a basement on a building if the building is on a pier? They hung the basement underneath the pier. So the city gets it in their head that, well, if we really wanna make more money, then what we need to do is we need to fill this tide flat area. We're gonna use some of the dirt from the regrade, and now we've got more developable land. Grand scheme. And it actually worked. The third project, and this was I think the big nail in the coffin of the first Chinatown. This project to build a tunnel that was going to connect Jackson Street, where the train stations were. Let's build a tunnel underneath the city. What is it that Seattle's got with tunnels? But let's build a tunnel underneath the city to connect Jackson Street on the south with Virginia Street on the north. It's a 1-mile tunnel that ran only slightly over the estimated time frame that they thought it would take to build this. Without the equipment, without Bertha the big digger, they managed to build this tunnel. And the Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Times said that this was going to cause a real problem for Chinatown, and that it was gonna be the death knell. That the Chinese must realize that they're gonna have to go, because we know that we're gonna build this tunnel and it's going to affect whatever buildings are going to be in the general location, but they weren't sure at the time exactly where that general location was going to be. They were only saying, well, you know, the city's got the power of eminent domain, and if you don't leave willingly, then you will end up losing your property anyway. So the Chinese started thinking about where they were gonna move. Where are we gonna go? We can't go north because the north is already developing as a financial district. The west is the waterfront, so that is also out. The south that's the train station and the tunnel, also out. So the only option was to take a look at what was happening with the regrade area, fresh land. It was a new opportunity. So at the same time that Seattleites, and this is right around that turn of the 20th century, and they're thinking about what are we gonna do with Chinatown? At the exact same time, San Francisco suffers a horrific, horrendous earthquake that levels Chinatown. This is in 1906. Sean, was that April?
I don't remember.
I know you know this.
I wasn't alive then.
What a wise guy. Okay, so at the same time that Seattle is planning this move of where Chinatown is going to go, San Francisco is also looking at the exact same issue because they're gonna have to rebuild Chinatown. And at the time, San Francisco city authorities are wanting to move the Chinatown out of the downtown because the land is becoming too valuable. Why do we want to put Chinatown back here? They didn't even like the way that it looked in the first place. And they have this image in their head, oh no, you know the Chinese, they're just gonna build the same thing that they built before. We didn't like it then and we're not gonna like it now. The Chinese are too smart. They end up hiring, excuse me, an architectural firm to come up with a new plan for how the buildings can help satisfy that image that people have of the way Chinese America needs to look. So they have plans drawn up and the construction is taking place at a feverish pace to build these two buildings that ended up being so incredibly satisfying of what Chinese America really needs to look like. And they took the idea from a traditional building form, this is the pagoda in Suzhou. The forms that they duplicated, they look good, but they're not architecturally, they're not structurally sound. They don't imitate the real construction mode of what is the most complicated construction and structural design that exists of all buildings anywhere. But they duplicated the look, and the look was deeply satisfying. Okay, so Seattle, they know that they're gonna have to move too. And in 1906, Seattle finds out that they're going to be the site of the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, so a grand World's Fair, the first World's Fair that Seattle had. And the Chinese, they funded this themselves. Now, in World's Fairs, the home country contributes financially to the construction of whatever exhibits are built in a World's Fair. And in this case, though, China was so mad at the United States for how they were treating Chinese Americans. Whatever happened with the violence, expulsion, murder, robbery, whatever happened with that, China was not unaware that this was happening. But the way that they were getting back was, all right, you want to build this exhibit, you do it on your own because we are not going to fund you. So basically, the 450 Chinese that were still living in Seattle actually ended up taking the donations and building the Chinese village. So they were also aware of this kind of chinoiserie, this look of the Oriental that was going to kind of bring people in. To them, it was, this was a fair. We're gonna satisfy the people that come to the AYP Expo. And this is what they designed and this is what they built, but it wasn't what they built when it came to the move of Chinatown. They had a different idea and a different image. This is Chun Ching Hak again, of the Watchung. This gentleman is Gun Dip. Gun Dip was a merchant. He was an astute businessman. He was also the honorary Chinese consul for Washington, Oregon, Idaho. And these two men together came up with one of the grandest schemes. I wish right now that we had the guts that these guys had in coming up with an idea to reconstruct Chinatown. Chun Ching Hak buys this property, just the land, and holds on to it while Gun Dip follows that same idea of let's do a corporation. The corporation then will own whatever it is we construct on these two parcels of land. By the time, now he incorporates, or he gets this corporation registered with the state of Washington in 1909, and they call it the Gong Yik Investment Company. Gong Yik, translated, is mutual, for the mutual benefit. Is that lovely or what? And the whole idea of this is we're gonna build a Chinatown that's not going to be moved. And we're going to give everybody the opportunity to buy into these buildings. Okay, so Chen Ching Hock owns this land. He waits until the incorporation is done by Goon Dip. And then he sold his land, this property, to the Gongik Investment Company for $1. Now, even in 1909, $1? Phenomenal. These guys were committed to building Chinatown, and they're SROs. How grand is that? The plan then, 1,100 shares. Anybody could buy into the Gongik Investment Company. It was $50 a share, 1,100 total shares. Now, it's kind of interesting because the bylaws of the corporation never accounted for the sale or purchase of any additional shares. So if you bought into, let's say you buy 5 shares of the Gongik Investment Company, there was no mechanism to sell them. And so what's happened is, over the last 110 years, those original buyers then, you leave it to 2 children, 3 children, your wife, she passes away, you leave it to, and so this is filtered down for 110 years. The corporation is still very much alive and kicking. The other thing that they did was they offered the commercial storefront spaces to those businesses that were located in the first Chinatown for a discounted rate if they would make the commitment to move to the new buildings. And they did. The other thing that they did was they offered and they promised the Lung Kong Tin Yi Family Association a permanent home in the Gongik West building for as long as they wanted it, in perpetuity. Now, none of this is written, okay, except for the bylaws. The bylaws and the articles of incorporation are, but the promises that they made, that was your word. And your word was your bond. And you didn't need to worry about the piece of paper because that bond that you gave, that handshake that you did, followed. It's amazing because so many of these businesses, it's only in recent times that they've realized that it's okay to have a lease. Yeah, well, that's a whole other story. But the importance of the residential hotels, actually 13 of the 14 Chinese associations were located in residential hotels. The only one that was not was the Zhenghua Benevolent Association, and that's because they bought their own building. They had their own building constructed. The prescription of how to do this, though, Chen Ching Hock was a genius. The construction of the Gongik Investment Company, the West Gongik building and the East Gongik building, that whole idea of incorporating was one that followed other buildings in Chinatown. The vision that these guys had was that this is something that other buildings will do in Seattle, but also this is gonna be the prototype for Chinatowns all across America. That they could do this through incorporation and building residential hotels. So the building on the upper left, this is the Fong Yik Investment Company built Chin Apartments, also one of the Tongs, the Hop Sing Tong. The Wah Chong, which was Chen Ching Hock's, again, his corporation, built the Eastern Hotel. They actually ended up selling it to the Wah Song Corporation. The Milwaukee Hotel on the lower left was the Daniel Investment Company. And Daniel was actually Goon Dip's son. And Goon Dip had 5 different corporations that he licensed with the state of Washington, so he would just pick whichever one that he wanted, given whatever the development project was going to be. He built the Milwaukee Hotel. And then this building was built by the Kong Leong Investment Company, and this is the Bing Kung Tong. And from what I've read about Walla Walla, the Bing Kung Tong was the big organization in Walla Walla's Chinatown. So if you were a member of the Bing Kongs here, you were also an affiliate with the Bing Kong in Seattle. This is a splendid building, and it's really interesting because it has quite a few names to it, and actually the Norway Hotel is one of them. So what made these Chinese American? All right, we know that they're residential hotels, but the Chinese Americans also made modifications to the designs. And this is, actually you can kind of see, I guess, the balcony that's right here. Projecting and recessed balconies. The theory is anytime you see one of these buildings that has a projecting or recessed balcony, the Chinese have at one time or another occupied it. They may have owned it, they may have occupied it, but that's a sure indication because that balcony is the transferring of tradition, Chinese tradition. Because balconies were used as living spaces, places for children to play. They had so many different uses that they ended up being part of the SROs, that if you walk by them and you see one of these balconies, you know that there's an important function that's taking place on the inside of that space. And they elevated a lot of, I would say the majority of the association spaces are up on these upper floors because it gave them dignity, but also it was economically sound. You know, why would you give away commercial space, storefront space at grade that has the possibility of bringing in money? So don't waste it for that. We'll put the associations upstairs. And the other thing is the insides are just resplendent. They're absolutely beautiful. This is what the Bing Pong looks like if you are fortunate enough to get inside. Beautiful color, flags, banners. Excuse me. All of these association buildings had photographs of Chiang Kai-shek in them. And then the furnishings, mahogany. These are all imported mahogany with mother of pearl inlay. They're absolutely gorgeous, but all of this starts to make them examples of not just the SROs, but also of cultural expression. By 1930, Seattle is actually operating 2 Chinatowns, even though they said that the Chinese were gonna have to leave that first location. What does end up happening is that the city, in another one of its grand plans, makes the decision that they want to do a Second Avenue extension that's going to, unfortunately, is gonna cut through that first Chinatown. And you can maybe kind of see this, it's kind of difficult, but this was basically the alignment of where the Second Avenue extension was going to go. So this is the first building, second building, third building. And this is what it ended up looking like. So rather than sell the buildings out and have them demolished, they made the decision that they would sell some of the development right to the city and they would retain what was ever left of the building. So this is actually, if you go into this area now at Second Washington, this is what used to be there in the Watchung development, and this is what's there now. So this building, this is what's left of the Phoenix Hotel, the building on the right. This was really the death knell of that first Chinatown. So through the decades, each one of these decades since 1930 has given the district yet another challenge or problem. Sometimes challenge is kind of a euphemism, but there were so many things that happened decade after decade. And just as a partial list, if you look at this, the community eroded just a little bit with each one of these decades passing. And the Depression, World War II, and the incarceration of Japanese Americans that really had a devastating effect on management and ownership of Japanese American hotels. The construction of I-5 that wiped out the eastern part of the district. The construction of Yesler Terrace Family Housing Project, yes, it was a low-income housing project, but it also took out residential hotels, Chinese businesses, churches. We kept losing part of the district until 1970, when the big loss came with the Ozark Hotel fire. Now, the Ozark Hotel was an SRO located in the north part of the downtown. It wasn't even in Chinatown. The city decided that they needed to update the building, fire codes, We've got to do it because people were suing the city because the city was too lax about doing inspections on the SROs. The Ozark Hotel fire was the second worst fire for a hotel in America's history. The first worst fire happened in Chicago, and I'm sorry, I cannot remember the name of that hotel, but Seattle got the second worst. So in 1970, the city passes legislation, and they said, all residential hotels, you have to have sprinkler systems, quick release front doors, so the front doors are no longer open. If you wanna stay in an SRO, how are you going to get from an at-grade position to get up the stairs if the doors are now locked? For the first time ever, the front doors were locked. So sprinkler systems, transom windows have to be sealed. All doors have to have peepholes. Now, the cost, if you're running a residential hotel and the cost, you're bringing in about $2.50 a night for your room, how are you going to come up with $11,000 to replace the doors? That's what it would be in contemporary terms, 11 grand. The city passed the legislation, but they did not make any provision for how is an owner going to afford to bring these buildings up to code. And so one by one, the buildings start closing. Now, according to the city regulation, you could not have the upper floors used as residential. No one could sleep behind the commercial storefronts because there were a lot of living spaces that were being used there too, but the city put a stop to that also. You could still run the commercial storefronts because nobody is sleeping there. That was the issue. You can't sleep anywhere in the building, but you can operate. This is why when you went in the district and people would complain, they said, why don't these people care about their buildings? Look at all these floors that are closed up. They didn't have a choice. And one by one, all of these buildings started closing. No more residences. Now, what happens is, one by one, you see the buildings close, but there's also a tremendous amount of decay, neglect, water damage that takes place. And the city seriously underestimated what this was going to mean for affordable housing in the downtown. The light wells, nobody was there to take care of what was happening with drainage systems, so there was a lot of interior damage. So this just kept compounding. Association rooms on the upper level, you couldn't access them because the buildings were closed. There was no electricity, no services that were going to be feeding those upper floors. This is actually the association room in the West Gongyak building. Vandalism, pigeons. I hate pigeons. They do more damage to buildings and they're really aggressive. I don't know if you know that or not. I found out when I went in the Milwaukee hotel and it was still closed and I opened up the door and there's like 3,000 pigeons in there. That, it was, anyway. This was the largest SRO in the city. It was the largest SRO that just happened to be in the district. This was the Hotel Puget Sound, 444 rooms, lost. Affordable housing, lost. This is a Dean Wong photograph. This is a Filipino-American immigrant. He had only been in Seattle a week. He was hired to clean the masonry, to clean all of the cement off the masonry, for which he got 15 cents a brick. The city severely underestimated what this was going to mean for low-income housing. They thought that if they passed the Ozark ordinance, they would lose 1,000 units of affordable housing. In reality, at the end of the first year, the city had lost 3,000 units of housing and counting from the closure of all of these hotels. So what do? They know that they're losing the district. People are leaving the district. And so they do, what do they call it, the makeup call? In 1973, they passed the International Special Review District Ordinance. And this is supposed to put together a board of individuals that are going to review projects that are done in the district. So any project if you want to put a flower pot out on the sidewalk, you have to take it to the ISRD so that they can review it. The problem with the legislation is they answer what something looks like. Like they'll get totally hung up on what shade of green you're gonna paint your door. But they can't do anything about compliance. If a building gets put next to a historic structure, as long as they meet zoning code, you can't say anything. It's so incredibly weak. But they thought that the ISRD will put a boundary around this district, and now anything that gets constructed in here, it has to fit the guidelines of the ISRD. In 1986, they fill out an application, a consultant fills out an application. Now, people really didn't understand SROs then. And they send it to the National Register of Historic Places, it gets approved, but there's a little core area, and that's what this outline is. This is actually the outline of the National Register of Historic Places, of the residential hotels. Now, at the beginning of this, I told you there were 29 hotels in the district. Back up. I think one of my images is missing. But I told you that there are 29 hotels. 28 of them are within the protected district, meaning that those buildings cannot be altered. They can't be altered from the exterior. They cannot be torn down. They have to remain just the way they are. And that has brought a whole new area of stress when it comes to the revitalization of the buildings. Now, not everything has been bleak, but the district has been in a sleep, or it went into a sleep that lasted about 25 years. And it's taken some very committed individuals to look at how do you restore these buildings, because it's incredibly difficult. The Eastern Hotel was a building that was restored in 1998 by Interim Community Development Association. And you'll kind of see that a number of the hotels in the district have either been refurbished by Interim or the Seattle Chinatown International District Preservation and Development Authority, which is also another PDA. It is an independent entity, but it was started by the city of Seattle. This is Bob Santos, who was the former executive director of Interim. And the building has been just resplendently brought back to life. It started out as 100 rooms. It now has 46 rooms of affordable housing. And then there is the East Gongik building, the land that I told you that was sold for $1. The East Gongik, or the Gongik Investment Company, sold this hotel to the Wing Asian Museum, and for the first time, the museum actually had a permanent home. They were no longer going to be leasing space in the CID. They would have their own home. And you can kind of see this was the dedication. This is former Governor Locke. And this is the Yik Fung store. The Yik Fung was located in the West Gongik building, but when the owner, Jimmy Marr, retired, he decided that he would donate the store to the museum. And so they literally took the store out and they plugged it into the East Gongik. Then there's the Milwaukee Hotel, which is an example of entrepreneurship. James Coe of Coho Properties, he purchased the Milwaukee Hotel, the Mar, and the Alps Hotel, all within the same year, because he had this, Mr. Coe was a devout Buddhist, and he had this feeling that it was his responsibility to bring these buildings back to housing. Unfortunately, they're all market rate housing, but at least they are housing and they've been refurbished. What is interesting is that the Milwaukee Hotel, in an area that used to be the Milwaukee Cafe, he dedicated that to the Confucian and Buddhist Learning Center in perpetuity. They pay no rent, but it's part of the history that he felt that the district needed to retain. For these buildings, particularly if they're vacant, fire is the biggest enemy. It's the most frightening thing that could possibly happen. And that's exactly what happened on Christmas Eve in 2014. The Louisa Hotel literally lost half of its building. Now, by code, the family who owned it, the Wu family, had the opportunity. They could say, okay, we're packing it in, we're gonna sell it, we're gonna sell the land, we're not gonna bring this building back. I mean, if you lose half of your building, and where are you gonna come up with the money? to restore this, to rebuild it. It took the Wu family 4 years to find a partner that would be willing to help them come up with the money to revamp the building. And this is what it looked like. Unfortunately, it opened right before the pandemic. The pandemic, wow. The bleak news and I'm gonna say the new challenges that the district is facing. One of them is the residential registration and inspection ordinance. And the second one is the Mandatory Housing and Affordability Act. The first one just established a new series of upgrades that all residential units have to meet. And it's up to the building owner to hire a contractor to inspect the building, and then the report goes to the city, and then the city stamps it and says, yes, you can continue to rent this property. The MHA was a little trickier. The whole idea of the Mandatory Housing and Affordability Act was that they were looking at this and partnering it with another piece of legislation that was going to increase density in the district. That's how you make money, right? And because it's so close to the train station and the light rail that we want to be able to increase the possibility of development. Now, you can't increase it in that historic core. That's hands off. But everything around the core, sure, they upzoned it. This is a photograph of a public meeting that took place in the Nice Vets Hall so that the community could come in and give their feedback on whether they wanted to see the density and the area upzoned. Once you upzone the property, you can't reverse it. That's it. You have to go with it, because otherwise property owners, if you try to reverse it, a property owner is gonna say, wait a second, I could develop 25 units on this land and now you're telling me I can't? They're gonna sue the city. So all of this land that you see in gray, all of it was upzoned. Okay, so that was part one. Part two is that if you're a developer and you're going to develop any property around here, you either have to pay into a fund for affordable housing, or you have to include affordable housing units in your development. Most developers opt to pay. And the problem for the district is, let's say they pay for the money that goes into this pot of money that is overseen by the Seattle Housing Authority. The Housing Authority then makes this money available for low-income housing, but it can be built anywhere in the city. So maybe this land, it's coming out of the life's blood of the community, but it can be constructed somewhere else. It's really not fair to the district. The most devastating effect it's had has actually been on Little Saigon, because Little Saigon has no protection at all. No one has ever written a history of Little Saigon, and they needed it to protect them. The Republic Hotel, because of the Rio ordinance, they threw in the towel. This was owned by one of the family associations. They could not bring that building up to contemporary code, and so they decided to sell it. Other challenges for the district, the pandemic. In order to protect property, because anti-Asian sentiments have been on the peak again, probably just as high as they've been since The Wasp and Puck magazine were published. The Chinatown International District is actually, when it comes to crime and murder, it is the worst neighborhood in the city. And I'm gonna say with the least police patrol. With the buildings boarded up, and rampant graffiti, tagging on these buildings, and it doesn't even matter if the buildings have been restored. The tagging is terrible. Let me tell you about the ordinance that covers that. If you own a building and your building is tagged, if somebody sees it, now you're not gonna see it too easily on your own building if it's up high. You have to call the city, the Department of Neighborhoods, and say, hey, the Republic Hotel, the Alps Hotel, the Norway Hotel, it's tagged. The owner then has a limited amount of time to remove that tagging, and if they don't do it, they're fined. Now, the Gong-Yik has seen this happen with the building across the street, but they don't wanna call, because why would you wanna rat on your neighbor who then is going to have to come up with all kinds of money to remove this tagging? Everybody in the district, all the businesses pay into a fund that is managed by the Business Improvement Association. The BIA will remove tagging, but they'll only take off tagging up to 6 feet. And most of the tagging is not happening in that 6 foot, it's happening above. They're getting rid of those wonderful advertisement signs, those ghost signs that are part of the district. Walla Walla's got great ghost signs, by the way. I spent yesterday looking at them. Problem, the ordinance is not meeting the needs, not of what's going on in the district. When I mentioned to you the 29 buildings and the one building that's outside of the protected district, this is it. It's the Busch Garden Restaurant. The restaurant was down here, these were the two levels of residential housing. It was just an oversight. Had they understood more about residential hotels in 1986, it would have been included. But now, the developer wants to take this building down, the community, okay, Interim is fighting this, people in the community are fighting this. They don't wanna see a 17-story building constructed here, right next to the new Central Hotel operated by Skipta as an affordable housing project. Huge issue. It's not over yet, folks. And then things like earthquake. This is an image of the 2001 Nisqually quake that severely damaged the Cadillac Hotel. The city, for years, decades, have been looking at the passage of an unreinforced masonry ordinance that will require all of the masonry buildings in Seattle to be seismically retrofitted. The cost of this, I looked at this, because they're intending to launch this program by fall. And there are about 950 masonry buildings in the downtown. Most of these are in the downtown. The cost though, how are they gonna pay for this? They may get some money from FEMA, but it's not going to be a lot. They may get some money from HUD. They will not get any money from the city of Seattle. And why? Because the Washington State Constitution prohibits loaning city funds, quote, except for the necessary funds of the poor and the infirm. It does not cover something like this kind of project. The cost, they're estimating, and they've got 3 different levels of seismic retrofitting. Everything from minor retrofitting to full bore, you've got to tear out the interior walls and do bracing. The cost is between $24 and $87 a square foot. So to give you a better idea, a 22,000 square foot building, so basically half the size of one of the Gong-Yik Investment Company buildings, is going to cost about $650,000. And that's in 2019 money. By the time they actually get this thing launched, how are you gonna afford this? Who's gonna pay for this? How are they gonna do it? But they're gonna launch it in the fall. Before I open this up for questions, I want to end this with a commentary about the remaining flagship building that established the Chinatown International District. And this is my best buddy. This is the Gong-Yik West building. The Gong-Yik West, and this is when I was president of the board. We had our first redevelopment plan done for this building in 2015 to look at how are we going to build it, what are we gonna do with this building? The investment company, in 1910, when it was incorporated by the state, there were 3,200 such organizations. Now there are fewer than 60 from that 1910. So the Gong-Yik Investment Company, long-standing, 110 years, do you really want to sell the building? The Gong-Yik Investment Company will cease to exist if the building gets sold. Right now, there are, let's see, how many units? I'm sorry, I have to look this up. There are 158 rooms in this one building. only part of one story is open for rent. That's because that was all that the corporation could afford to renovate to meet the requirements of the Ozark ordinance. So they only operate 12 units. The units that the Gongik Investment Company rents, the rent is so low. It's between $200 and $500 a month. That's lower than any PDA, any CDA can charge. It's the lowest rent, I think, in the whole city. And all of the residents who live there are Chinese Americans, most of whom do not speak any English. And it's interesting because to be on the board, nobody on the board speaks Chinese. But somehow or another, it's always seemed to work. At last count, in order to restore this building, we need $38 million, which is a far cry from a building where the land and the building combined were $70,000. So the Gongik Investment Company, it has a board of 7 people. No one has ever gotten paid in 110 years of the board's history. It's all voluntary. Amazing. Gongik for the mutual benefit. I think the bigger question that's facing Chinatown right now is, can it be identified as Chinatown if there are no Chinese who live there anymore? If the buildings continue to be sold, how do we identify it? Do you want to put a plaque? I mean, that's what Portland has done. Chinatown is completely gone. It's eradicated in Portland. There are only 3 buildings that have anything to do with Chinese at all. But what they did, what the city of Portland did, was they put brass or bronze plaques periodically in the sidewalk. So as you walk along the sidewalk, you can see what used to be there. Nobody ever thought that these are like tombstones that mark the death of something. The big question for the Gongik is, what are they gonna do? Because time's running out. With both the unreinforced masonry ordinance, the fact that the building itself was only built with the idea that it was gonna last 60 years. So it's already surpassed its lifespan. But it needs everything, wiring, plumbing, the sewer system, all of it needs to be done to bring it up to code. Anyway, so I guess that's where I'll end before questions.
So as Dr. Wong stated, we're now gonna open up the floor to questions. Let's have a conversation. Anyone have something they want to ask? Yes.
You mentioned that most of Chinatown is not there anymore. Like people, where have they gone if they're not there?
Who live in Seattle?
Yes.
Oh, the city, when the Ozark Hotel ordinance was passed, the city just figured they'll find other housing. Where do they go? Some of them go to other properties that are owned by interim community development. So they manage what is it, the GO 10, the Rex Hotel, the Eastern, so there are other opportunities, but then you end up on a list. Lately though, one of the buildings that interim just constructed, it's a brand new building, it's Uncle Bob's place. What's happened though, because vandalism is so high, crime is so high in the district, that they're actually having a hard time getting people to rent in the district because they're too afraid. They've got to get, their hands around how are they gonna answer the escalating violence and crime that's taking place. But where do they go? They get on the list with Seattle Housing Authority, interim, the PDA, to try to find other accommodations. This is gonna be an issue with the Gongik too, because even though they only operate 12 units, those 12 units they're gonna be displaced. The other thing with this building is that the Gongik building has been the home to family associations, the Chinese school, the Luckney Music Club, the Buddhist temple. There's another temple that's located in that building. So if the building is closed, all of those units, all of those organizations and institutions that are the life's blood and the history of the district, they're all gonna be gone. The music clubs have been around since 1938.
Questions? Or I wanna follow up on that. You allude with the music club and some of the other things you've talked about to what community life was like. You wanna talk a little bit about, and also in the introduction to your book, talking about your own father's experience in these, excuse me, hotels. What was the scene like?
Oh, the community?
Yeah, what
Oh,
was the scene
wow.
like?
As part of writing Building Tradition, I was interested in talking to all of as many people as I could who lived there, whose parents operated the hotels, if they had a business that was one of the commercial storefronts. But all of the images that they would share with me about what the children did in the district, the district was shared by not just the Pan-Asian community, but Eastern, Northern, Western Europeans, African Americans, Native Americans were all part of this community. And the one thing that they all had in common was that they were poor, financially, socially. That's a whole other story. There was a richness in just the interaction of the community where people would take their lawn chairs down to the sidewalk and you'd set them up and you'd watch your kids play. They played baseball in the intersections. I asked one of the groups, the Main Street gang, well, what did you do when there was traffic? And he said, well, that was easy. We just yelled car coming and then everybody would go to the sidewalks. But the whole life's blood of the community was so different, so interactive. Absolutely beautiful. And we've lost it. I'm a city planner by background, but doggone it, I hate what the city does. They're so short-sighted. They don't do their homework. That's why it's really important for the community to keep pushing back.
So what is happening with the sound transit proposal? They were talking about maybe adding another station there and disrupting potentially what's going on.
Yeah. Evil. Sound Transit 3, the transit station that you're talking about, they had 5 alternatives. 2 of them were on 5th Street. They called it the 5th Street Shallow, the 5th Street Deep, 4th Street Shallow, 4th Street Deep, and can't remember what the 5th one was called, but it all had something to do with 5th or 4th Street. And I read over the EIS, really carefully. And the Sound Transit planners, they were just counting a really small number of residential units. They didn't cover anything that was even 1 block away from where the proposed station would be. Now, this would have disrupted the CID, the neighborhood, for over 10 years. Over 10 years of construction on the far western boundary of the CID. And it was really interesting to watch the factions. I think one problem that the district has always had is that they've got too many voices. You've got a little group of voices here and one here and one. They really needed to come together on this and stomp their feet and say, no, we're not gonna do this. This would have had such an incredibly devastating effect with construction. It would have displaced too many people. And who's gonna wanna live in a district where you're gonna be listening to construction 24 hours a day for 10 years? You're gonna lose residents. There were too many problems with the EIS. So there was one group that said no to Sound Transit 3. We don't want to see it there. And there's one group that said, yeah, go ahead and put it on 4th. 4th would have been 1 block farther to the west. They thought that was okay. What ended up happening is that some of the I'm going to call them the leaders in Chinatown, it actually split the leadership in Chinatown too, because you had some people that said we're okay with 4th and others that said absolutely not. What I did, and since I retired from the university, I really stepped away from the politics. I'm trying anyway, because I don't want to get sucked into that. I want to write. I wanna tell people about the history, and I wanna warn them not to make the same mistakes. But I don't wanna get into the fray of all this. I did though write an editorial. I didn't know what was gonna happen with it. But basically, I just told them, this is what the city has done, and these are the mistakes that have been made over and over again for Asian American Seattle. Not just Chinatown, but the Japanese, the Filipino American community, you might wanna think about these things. And, you give a few tours to the Sound Transit Board because you need the vote of the board. Those are the guys that you want their ear. Think about this. I don't tell them don't do it. I'd love to tell them don't do it, but I said, you may wanna think about this. The last I heard though, they said nix, no to the 4th and 5th Avenue Sound Transit possibilities. They said we'll build it north of the CID, we'll build it south of the CID. So now they're having to revisit the environmental impact statement to do a reevaluation of the potential for those two areas. The nice thing about either one of those other areas, and I don't know why they didn't think of this before, is that during the pandemic, the King County Administration Building closed. So you got this big behemoth, incredibly ugly building that's completely vacant. And there's another piece of land there that's also vacant. This is an opportunity for them to think about building the Sound Transit Station and revitalizing an area that's dead. Why didn't they think of this before? They're not thinking. But anyway, what I have heard, the last that I read, is that they took 4th and 5th off the table, which actually has made other people mad. Yes,
So, for me or
Emily.
so
ignore the man behind you.
so it sounds like you've spent a little time in Walla Walla. We have some plaques, right? We have some of the, ways of trying to at least start talking about the history of this region, which, includes the labor of Chinese Americans and other groups where we haven't made it super visible yet. Do you have, the fresh eyes to tell us, like, what do you like besides plaques? What other kinds of things should we be thinking about to preserve the history that we have in this community and not make some of these mistakes?
I don't know Walla Walla well enough to put myself.
Did you notice anything as you were walking around? Just what struck you, I guess, maybe that's better.
Okay, when Cheris told me about this opportunity, I was so excited about this, and I started looking at the local newspapers, the Sanborn fire insurance maps, and I wanted to look around the area to see where the Chinatown was. It's really interesting because in 1884 it was in one location, and 10 years later it was in a completely different location. It makes me really sad because I was thinking about the Bing Kung and how lively it would have been, that whole block that was the Pacific Enterprise building. I've only seen one photograph of it, but what a fantastic building. And there was absolutely no question that was an SRO, absolutely none. But a gigantic building. I guess I really don't like plaques on the ground. That's just too much like a cemetery. I think that there are a lot of other opportunities to celebrate. I'd actually like to see the Chinese American community come back to Walla Walla. That would be really wonderful, to build a new SRO, and they are building new ones. But kiosks are great, statues also great. But I think I would have to spend a lot more time looking at Walla Walla's history. What I would like to know though is why did the owner who bought the Pacific Enterprise building in 47, I would like to know why he closed the residential portion. Because that evidently was a big catalyst that kind of expelled the people who were living in that building to find other accommodations. And I guess there were 50 people living in the building at the time. But I'd like to know why it was closed. Was it another ordinance that was going on in Walla Walla? If you're interested in doing research like this, Sanborn fire insurance maps are great. You've got wonderful city directories. Side sewer cards also. People don't typically think about checking out sewer cards. But every time there's a redevelopment, they have to apply to the city public works if they're going to make any kind of changes, and every single building is going to make changes in their sewer system. And there's a really great record that is part of the sewer systems. Yeah. Hal, I love this stuff. I'm sorry.
Well, I might be able to add just a little bit about the Pacific Express. My family once owned that building.
Oh, really? Do you have photographs?
I'm not sure, we'd have to look deep in it. We have some things, most of the farming stuff, but,
If I give you my email, will you?
well,
Would you send me a photo if you
Bill
find
Howell,
one?
Certainly. But I do remember one thing, the family owned it, and then the Denny eventually bought it. And I actually told my grandfather, says, no, you shouldn't own it, because then you'll get the Chinese, the rest of they'll resent you for owning it.
Really?
Yes. So he sold it to the Denny. For that building.
Wow.
Yes. But I remember stories of that my grandfather would say when he was really young. He said, the Chinese New Year's, we talked about the liveliness of the town. He said, they knew we were going to celebrate Chinese New Year. He said, oh, the Chinatown is going to go wild. And so the town would come together during Chinese New Year's and have the fire trucks around the different corners. And they said they would line them up and they wanted to watch me. So when it was done, it was about 1.5 inches thick of burnt punk chow.
The papers and, yeah.
Firecrackers. And they said the whole town came out for that because they said it was a big thing.
Yeah.
Where the fireman's statue is on Main Street was where there was a building there at one time. It burnt down, which is why, and there was a death, a fatality in the fire department. Louis O'Con, the O'Con family, who had the florist shop further up the street, owned the tailoring shop in there. And there were 2 or 3 stories underground, which, since they lived across the creek from us in that part of town, took us down, showed us the opium den there. They just left it the way it was. The tunnel that went kitty corner across the street to where the Dakers Hotel is, there is a whole underground here. Some of it's been filled in with concrete, unfortunately. Why, I don't know, we've done that. But there's a lot of history here, and there are a lot of people in their 70s, 80s, early 90s who are Asian American, who live here. I know 3 women who were interned, which isn't part of this, but whose family ran the Chinese shop on Main Street, and whose daddy ran the cafe on the Main Street Plaza. And they talk about the businesses, the interactions, the curfews. They were old enough as young people to know all of that. I was interested enough when I did a month-long study at the UW years ago. We got 3 days at the archives there. This is at Sandpoint, whatever. And we could choose any boxes we wanted and photocopy the heck out of them. And I thought I would at that point do something about the Chinese, Japanese, and Walla Walla. And so I photocopied a lot of stuff, but I never got around to it. And unfortunately, I did not keep it. But there is undocumented stuff there for the looking. But
Do any of the libraries, historic societies, do they have photographs also? Because one thing I'd really love to see is a picture of the Bing Kung Tong building. Because it was mentioned in, Walla Walla 2020? Yeah, they mentioned that building specifically, and there's one photograph, but it's so tiny that you can't see what that building looked like.
You might be able to get something. The Whitman College has a good collection. They've been here so long. That the Penrose Library.
We have a box and I've gone through it, so we can talk about what's in the box. And then Walla Walla 2020 has the plaque for Chinatown, which is on 4th and Rose, and I think there's a reproduction of it on there.
Oh, good,
Let's see if I can track it down if that is indeed.
yeah.
Where the China building was, you know, the one I remember, because my dad would say, oh, this is where it was. And when I was a little kid, you know, we're talking about over like 50 years ago. And he would say, oh, those are the steps to the China building. It's like, I'm a little kid, it's like, well, wow. You know? But he would say that's where the Latino, the Fiesta food
Garcia
market, or whatever.
Barata, they're on, what is that?
Well, Caldwell
Fifth and-
Baker, kind of
Caldwell
there,
Baker's
yeah.
Part of the back, yeah.
Yeah, that's, it was, used to, for a long time, just the steps were left, and then eventually they disappeared.
The Whitman Archives does have materials, and St. Paul's Episcopal Church archives, which also are just in a terrible mess, had 2 or 3 Chinese congregants for years and years, and they just gave us their stuff, which is in our archives in the basement. It's uncatalogued and is there for the waiting. Susan Monahan is
And Susan Monahan speaking Norman.
eager to get hold
I
of
think
that.
you've all got your work cut out for you.
Making a community project here.
Yeah, this sounds good.
A
Excellent.
doctoral dissertation on this. Encourage your DWS students to.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'd like to talk to folks here, just.
It happened to me, it can happen to you. Sean knows that.
Any final questions for Dr. Wong?
Did you, I guess maybe, did you find in relation to the pool of money due to rezoning, like for affordable housing? When you talked about it in your slideshow, did you find, or do you know if that caused economic and or like racial segregation in the city of Seattle? I know I'm from Chicago and it's a big, I mean, Chicago's a very segregated city on accident, not on purpose, but it economically and racially is very separated. So I wondered if that was the same issue when people would buy that land and then not replace the affordable housing if the affordable housing got built in the same regions all the time, if that makes sense.
It's pretty much up for grabs. I mean, if you have a project that is an affordable housing project and then you access money competitively from the Seattle Housing Authority. What has happened in the neighborhood, and I mentioned to you, Little Saigon has really been the community that's under the most threat because the buildings are typically 1-story, two-story buildings. They have no history that's been written of the neighborhood, and so that history would have given that neighborhood some teeth to help protect it. The new buildings that have been going in that area, and you can kind of look at the census data to see what's been happening with Seattle CID. It's interesting because every year the census tracts change a little bit. So it's very hard to make comparisons of what's taking place with the demography. Okay, so that's one aspect of it. Interim community development does a pretty good job keeping track of census material. And what we have noticed is that the percentage of Asian Americans who live in the district continues to decline with every decennial census. And we see that actually the neighborhood's becoming whiter. Not that I'm against that, but it is creating a change. Economically, the district is changing a lot, and that's really sad. So, people say that we need to continue to open up the avenues for development of any kind. What we've kind of discovered, though, is that market rate development takes care of itself. If you've got a deep pocket, sort of like what's happening with James Wong's development of the Busch Garden, you're gonna come up with the money to build whatever you want. It's the low-income housing, affordable housing, that is the real big challenge because they're bidding on land that is open for anyone. So if you can get a piece of property, you're pretty fortunate. You're pretty fortunate because you can always get outbid by people who have got deep pockets. Yeah, it's a huge problem for the district. And I think it's gonna be a big problem for the Gongyak, for the West Gongyak building. I'm hoping they don't sell it to a developer. Market rate development.
Thank you again, Dr. Wong.
Thank you so much.